First speaker tonight is Trevor Nottle, but before that, I would like to just have an announcement that we would like to send our condolences to the South Korean delegates and the Indian delegates for the recent catastrophes. Thank you. I would like to introduce Trevor Nottle on the history of gardening in Australia. Thank you.
Thank you. Golly, those lights are bright. I should have worn a sunshade. A tennis visor might have been better. Okay, well, let's get started because we don't have very long. Mind you, we do have a short history, so it's better. But let's get started, okay? I won't comment on images much, and if you want to know what they are, I'll tell you afterwards, if you just ask me. Oh, there we go. Right, so it's really about trying to find out where we are, and we're still not there yet. We haven't reached a consensus about gardening in Australia. Things are still developing. First people who discovered Australia assumed that there were no people here. By that, I think they meant there were no people here with whom they could deal. There were people here, quite a few of them, and they spoke around 700 different languages. So if you were Captain Cook and stepped ashore at Botany Bay or in Sydney Cove, who would you talk to? They didn't have organisations that we would recognise as nations or states. They just lived in their local clan groups and tribes, and yes, they had interactions with each other, but there were no formal state-like organisations. So in effect, even though King George III said to Cook and Bligh and others, when you get to wherever you get, make a treaty with the local people, showing them that we will respect their land rights and we will look after them. All we want to do is come ashore and fix up our boats and get some water and maybe do a little trade for food if there is any, and we'll go on our way. But it didn't work out that way, unfortunately. We'll come to those people in it. So it was and is an occupied land, not an empty land. And that's really where all of our troubles began, with that misunderstanding and the inability to communicate. So here we go, Captain Cook landing and taking possession of Australia for the British Crown. And I would draw your attention to the central figure just underneath the flag is a Negro boy bearing wine and wine glasses. He wasn't a local, he was an import, but he was quite a significant one because of this contested ground and contested history that we're still getting to grips with. So here's a modern take on that same picture. And you can see, if you might be able to make out that in the background is the original engraving. It's overlaid with a modern painting by Jackson Pollock, which is in the National Gallery. And then the artist, Gordon Bennett, has coloured the images in a way that he feels represents the taking of possession and its impact. Other people thought it was invasion. And although it wasn't done by conquest, they certainly took over the land they wanted and used it. Okay, all right. Right, well, you perhaps realise that Cook and Banks and all his crew eventually made it back to England, And Sir Joseph Banks, well, he was an interesting chap. He was a mover and shaker, if you can put it that way, and an adventurer, and he was certainly a royalist, and he was a meddler. When he got back to England, he wrote a very important report and presented it to Parliament, and it described the bit of Australia that he had seen as rich land, large trees, lots of grass, and good rivers. Now, I don't know where he got all that from, but it certainly wasn't from what you would see at Botany Bay or Sydney Cove. But he made this report, and he was very keen as an advocate for settling in Australia. And he wasn't keen for the benefit of Australia. He was trying to show the British Parliament that he was an advocate for some of the problems they were facing. They had a huge population of petty criminals, mostly held in rotting ships in the waterways of England, in the south particularly, and they were also about to face more problems with a whole lot of people in America who didn't want to be part of the new republic, and they wanted the British government to resettle them somewhere. And he was involved in that as well. So here he is. He wasn't the most popular chap with a lot of people. This is a cartoon by James Gilray, and it's called The Great South Seas Caterpillar, which is not a very flattering description. And you can see, I hope you can see, that he's trailing not just botanical specimens, but maritime specimens and shells and slug-like creatures that are crawling along the line on the land. Things that he brought back as part of his contribution to the expedition. So eventually the government did decide to send several fleets containing convicts to Australia, to Botany Bay. And here's the first one, leaving England, so the 13th of May, 1787. There were on board the 11 ships approximately 1,000 convicts and convict women and convict children. And there were approximately 400 soldiers, guards, and administrators who were going to take care of the new settlement, including the governor, Governor Phillip. Well, getting to Australia was quite a difficult thing in those days. So the first port of call was in the Canary Islands, where mostly they got fresh water and meat. And they would have seen these strange-looking plants too. Then they headed off across the Atlantic Ocean, and on the 5th of August, they arrived in Rio de Janeiro, where, because they didn't know where they were going, really, they collected cotton and sugarcane and pineapples and banana plants to take to the new colony, with the idea that eventually these plants would help to feed them. They knew already that the British government was expecting that they would very quickly become self-sufficient and that they wouldn't have to rely on frequent resupplies from Britain. From Rio de Janeiro, they sailed across the southern Atlantic to Cape Town, and that was their final port of call. Now, I'm not sure which way I'm supposed to point this. Cape Town obviously wasn't part of the British Empire then, it was part of the Dutch colonial empire, and Cape Town was governed by a governor of the Dutch East India Company, and he lived there in a substantial dwelling with a large botanical garden around it. And I think I can pinpoint it for you. There. All the way along there. That was that was called the Governor's Garden, and it was used as a supply point for plants that were going backwards to England and Europe and forwards into the new colonies around Java and Borneo. And the colonists on the First Fleet spent a few days there. They got water and more meat and more vegetables and some fruits. But at this point, the free settlers on the First Fleet went to buy things to establish farms when they got to Australia. So they bought cattle and horses and goats and sheep and fruit trees and lots of wheat, and they were to be the foundations of the first gardens in Australia. And it's thought that because it was the time of year it was, they brought some bulbs with them, mostly from the farmers' wives who just hoped to sell them things. So they brought things like this Brunsvigia. But there's no records really. The only record I've ever seen of people actually written record is by a man called Captain Watkin Tench, who was a captain of Marines and in charge of the guards for the convicts. And he wrote in his diary that he had in his cabin a geranium flowering that was red and that he had bought it from somebody in Cape Town. Well, eventually, almost 11 months after they left, they arrived. And that's where Circular Quay is now. So the Opera House would be on the left-hand side, and the main buildings of the city would be directly ahead, and slightly off where the flag is flying is the first government house. And so that was where the first settlement was made. Later pictures of the same scene show that there was a garden made at Government House, but the artists weren't really up to depicting what the actual plants were. They made things that looked okay, but they don't actually represent anything. It's surprising to see that whoever painted this painting actually managed to catch the gum trees fairly well. But remember, these people, the trained people, were trained in England and they were used to painting English trees. So gum trees presented quite a problem for them, which they took a little while to get the hang of. So they found here, this soil here was very rocky and very, very sandy. So it was unlikely to be very productive. Though they did try, but they failed. So they moved further inland, just some of them, exploring and looking for better land and better water supplies. And food was the first priority. As I said, they had to be self-sufficient as quickly as they could. And at Rose Hill, near Parramatta, what's in the suburbs of Sydney now, they found reasonable soil and were able to clear the land and plant some wheat. And the man's name was John Rouse, and he wasn't a gardener or a horticulturalist, but he had a little experience as a farmhand. And he managed to grow 11 acres of wheat, which obviously wouldn't be enough to feed 1,400 people. And he decided, I guess he would have decided with the governor, to keep all of the seed and not try to make flour with it, but to keep it all for the next year so that he'd have enough to plant a bigger area of land. But he's probably regarded as the first horticulturalist or even agriculturist in Australia. You can see their accommodation was pretty rugged, and this was after 30 or 40 years of settlement. But they grew pumpkins very well, as you can see in the picture. So But the early days of the colony did have a serious problem. There was no one in the fleet who knew anything about farming or gardening. Most of the people, the convicts, were, as I said, petty criminals from the cities, pickpockets and petty thieves, the sort of people that got jailed and convicted for stealing a loaf of bread, or a pair of shoes, or a handkerchief. But they were here, they knew something that some of us still don't know. They are here and they have to stay. They didn't have a choice about going back. So when their terms of jail were up, they were given a ticket of freedom and more or less kissed goodbye by the governor. Some of them got land grants, some of them stayed in Sydney, and some of them did well and many did not. But there was a dream about being here. This is John Glover, who's an established painter in England, and he settled in Van Diemen's Land, which is now Tasmania, and this is a painting that he sent back to England to his agents to sell. And it looks wonderful when you look at it, until you realise a few things. So there's Laurustinus. Roses, more roses, hollyhocks, more roses. Now, these things are supposed to be tree ferns, but he didn't really have the idea of them very well. You can't see it in great detail, but all around, there's an orchard planted there in a regular pattern. This up here is his studio with the big glass windows where he could paint in the fresh air, and where a little greenhouse here where he grew more tender plants and raised seedlings. So he was a proper gardener, but in order to paint a picture that convinced his patrons in England that he wasn't crazy in coming to Australia at the age of 65, he sent back this picture, which is like a Dutch flower painting. Everything lovely is put in all together regardless of the season. And this painting is usually on display in our gallery in North Terrace, not very far away. And if you can get up close to it, which you can see that it's got incredible detail. Madonna lilies, blue aquiledias, rosemarys, brooms, all sorts of flowers. So he had a practical garden with the orchard, but he also had a flower garden. And so he was one of our earliest and good gardeners, and successful too. Now, one of the things that happened in the colonies was some of those civilians who came out, pardon me, nearly all of them had been promised a land grant when they got here. And of course, the new governor was so busy trying to get accommodation built for the criminals, and a hospital, and a jail for the men, and a jail for the women, and barracks for the soldiers, and a church or two, and a courtroom, and a few other things as well. The free colonists started to get a bit feisty. They demanded that they got their land, which they did eventually. The most demanding got it first, and the rest got it later. But some of those people, like Alexander Macleay in particular, and one or two other big families, in the politics of the times and in what they had learnt in school from the French philosophers, they were very into free trade. And they meant free. No taxes, no import duties, no restrictions on what they did. And it wasn't actually agreed to, but they did it because they were far away from anybody who could actually prevent them. And Alexander Macleay and John MacArthur and William MacArthur and a few others, even Mrs. Busby, hired or bought their own ketches and sailing ships and sailed away to buy things elsewhere. Now, at the time, the British East India Company was, in theory, given the right by the government of Britain to trade everywhere in the world, and anybody who wanted to trade was in England, who was English, who wanted to trade, they had to pay a fee to the East India Company for, in more or less, taking part of their control and their business. So the free traders, instead of doing that, sailed to what is now Indonesia. In those days it was called Batavia, and they went to Malaya, and they went to India, and they went to Hong Kong, and they avoided the imposts of the British East India Company by buying things there. They bought furniture, and they bought glassware and silverware and fabrics and, just about anything you could think of, and brought it back to Australia. Some of it was for their own pleasure, but a lot of it was for them to make money with. And so they traded freely and they brought things back. So this will be okay. Yes, this is going to be fast. The background picture is the Far T area of Shanghai, where there were lots and lots of nurseries. And there we can see some of the things that they brought back. The catalogue in the middle is a bit later, but it's a similar sort of thing. There was no plant quarantine, and you could buy whatever you wanted and bring it back. And I mean, it wasn't only plants and flowers. People brought back really smart things like deer, which we now have tens of thousands of in the hills just behind us. But that's the prevailing thing of the time. So that's why we're at where we're at. I'm sorry about that. I was involved in a car crash this morning and I'm a bit rattled. I wasn't injured, my car's okay, but it happened in front of me and I'm a bit shaken by it. So let's move on. Okay, so we've sort of moved forward a bit. We're in the early 1800s, around 1836 or so, and at that time you can see that English plant hunters were very busy and hard working as they explored the east for plants. The man who was doing the carrying wasn't asked about his opinion. The lady on the right is a lady called Teresa Maria Dillon Llewellyn, and she's been given her 21st birthday present, which is a plant press. And she's looking very excited about the prospect of collecting plants. In the foreground, you can see two books that were printed in Adelaide very early, about 1839. The first one printed actually is the dark one, the Vigneron and Gardener's Manual by George McEwen, who became more famous as the manufacturer of a lot of jams. He had an orchard towards past Athelston, just in the Adelaide Hills. The other one was, the yellow one is The Amateur Gardener for South Australia, was written by Ernst Heine, who was a German trained gardener. He worked in Melbourne first for the Melbourne Botanic Gardens when Baron von Müller was there. And the German community had a lot of strong connections with each other across Australia, particularly in the fields of botany and horticulture. And so his family nursery is still going here on the Norwood Parade. If you're ever up that way, you'll find it. And so there's a long tradition for some families to be involved in it. And to grow things and bring things. Heine was one of those who imported a lot of plants, and his diaries show that he had huge losses, which wasn't unusual in the days before the Wardian case. But he imported, for instance, 10,000 hyacinth bulbs from someone in Holland, and he paid for them, and when they arrived they were all rotten because they'd been packed in barrels of sawdust, which was a habit in those days, and they were stacked on the deck, which was also the habit in those days, and he was very lucky that they hadn't been thrown overboard, because that was the first thing that happened. If there was ever a storm or a gale coming, the captain would order the sailors to clear the decks so that they could do what they needed to do to keep the ship safe. And the first things that went overboard were the barrels of plants and trees and shrubs that might have otherwise survived, the rats and the rotten water. But never mind, they still got here and he persisted. And then, of course, we got that very special invention, which helped us a lot. So you can see there, it's a pretty sentimental picture. It's a print taken after a proper painting, but it's pretty good in terms of following it. But it shows a scene in Melbourne where on the table there's a pot of primrose flowers in flower, and it's a bit made up, like that other convention about the Arcadian garden in Tasmania, but it does show the power of sentiment and the remembrances of the old country. Now, in the middle where that primrose is the bottom half of a Wardian case, which was a stout timber case with a framework inside which would hold pots in place. And it was this case was lined with tin and then with moss, damp moss. Then the pots were put in place, and on the top was screwed and caulked with, caulking, yes, hemp and tar, a glass framework heavily protected by wooden slats on the outside that were screwed down, so it was like a miniature greenhouse, and plants could be transported around the world, and with nearly 100% success. So whereas previously plants had been lost at a huge rate, now it was possible to bring plants from just about everywhere and send them back again, because Australian plants at this time were incredibly popular. Not for gardens, of course, but for conservatories and greenhouses. So let's move on. Okay. We get there? Yeah, okay. So all those new plants were then supported by the arrival of staff. Now, these are the gardeners at a place you unfortunately won't be able to visit, called Adelaide. It's about 140 kilometres north of here. But I'll just show you here. That guy is the head gardener. That's his son, and that's another son. And all three of them were from Germany, and they all became head gardeners at that place. It's not quite like Miss Wilmot with her 140 gardeners, but this place had 14. And that was considered pretty good for those days. But the place, it's Adelaide Station, did have to be pretty much self-sufficient in food. So they spent a lot of time growing things like cucumbers in glass straighteners so that you could have a straight cucumber sandwich and things like that. They grew grapes in a greenhouse. They had a big display conservatory with orchids and ferns and a huge rose garden, which at the time was said to be the biggest rose garden in the Southern Hemisphere. And that is in the process of being restored right now. So we have, there's a Wardian case. You can see it's got a wooden top structure with glass lime washed underneath, and then wooden battens on the outside to provide shade and protection to the glass. And that part, that triangular part, lifts off, and underneath is a big tray with the tin lining and the framework that supports all the potted plants. And that one is one of several that survive at another garden near here at Norton Summit, and it was brought out by a nurseryman who imported plants from Lodages and other similar nurseries in England at the time. And all of this stuff, this technology, was supported by amazing inventions. And there you are. If you've got aphids, you gently puff, but never suck. But one of the things that altered the way or influenced the way we gardened was the fact that we had migrants from many countries. To start with, we had mostly Germans, but also some Italians and a few Greeks, and a lot of Chinese during the gold rush. And they produced their own influences that have affected our gardens. You can see at the bottom left a German-type house with German-type topiary that still exists in Harndorf, just in the hills near here. And on the other side is an English-type cottage garden at the home of a person who was in charge of a big apple orchard in the hills at a place called Coromandel Valley. But further afield, out in the country, people were doing other things. Perhaps I should have explained that when South Australia was settled, it was settled by a royal proclamation which established a thing called the South Australia Company. And then that name was changed into the South Australian Land Company. And what it was people would buy shares, and if you bought enough shares, you got an acre of land in the town, like in Adelaide town, in the centre. You got 40 acres of land in the outside suburbs, outside the parklands, where you could farm. That was thought enough for a good farm. And if you were one of the heavy investors, you got thousands of acres of empty bushland out in what we would call the donga, where you could graze sheep, if you could find any shepherds. So people did go out into the country, and some of the people who came here as investors already came with plenty of money. Recent research has shown that many of them were from families that owned slaves in the West Indies. And when the British government banned slavery in 1835, they paid massive compensation, not to the slaves, but to the people who owned them. So if you were, say, a Scottish family who owned a sugar mill in Jamaica, you got quite a lot of money if your business had to close down because there were no slaves to operate it. And a lot of that money came here to buy places that would like the next one. Oh, wrong one. That one, yes. So out in the country, towards a place called Mintaro, there's a very grand house. It's not the only one, there's quite a few around. That was built by the Mortlock family, and that was the centre of their kingdom. Perhaps barony might have been a better word, but so there's that pattern of settlement. These people obviously didn't garden, but they did get lots of magazines and books from the UK, and they followed the fashions as best they could. As I said, getting gardeners and staff who knew what they were doing was hard, but they did give it a go. So, and then slightly later, more technology enabled a few other things to happen. And mostly it was about publishing books and magazines and bringing them to Australia. Now, we would be accustomed to getting magazines maybe 3 or 4 months late, but way back then, in the late 1800s, the magazines were usually bound up in one annual volume. So you can find the gardening notes of the day bound up in big volumes in houses like that one. Okay, but we did get those new ideas. Gertrude Jekyll, who's well known, I think, to most of you. You certainly know the Rose anyway. And she wrote quite a few books and wrote for Country Life. And she was very influential in people adopting ideas like you see in the coloured photograph that she took, that she used colour harmonies a lot. And that sort of fashion became established here. And even then, a bit later after that, there was another very famous writer, broadcaster and journalist and traveller, whose works also were brought here and disseminated very widely as the latest fashion from England. But all of these things demanded more water. As the cities grew and people had suburban homes, people wanted gardens, and once town water was available, that is piped water, people could grow lawns, and they did. So the first photograph shows a Chinese man working at Buyuli Station up near Warrabra, and you can see the size of the pump that brings the water up from under the ground, and he's off to water his vegetables. The tap there that says Red Tank is at Anlaby, and they had massive water storages from their own dams, and they blocked up rivers, and they had some springs and boreholes as well. But then you can see in the Botanic Gardens of Adelaide on the right, the fountain in the Rose Garden, and so things followed fashion, where they used a lot of water, and that's where the trouble really began. People followed fashions in all sorts of ways. You can see a house in Sturt Valley, which is topiary. You can see another house at the bottom, which was in Medindi, where incidentally the grass is made of broken wine bottles. And then somebody in Victoria has made a very traditional garden on the English style in their vegetable garden, so they're following fashions for things. Although we did have one of our own. We had our very own Gertrude Jekyll. Her name was Edna Walling. She migrated from England when she was a child, and her family and she lived in Melbourne. She went to Burnley Agricultural College and got a degree or diploma and set herself up as a landscape gardener. And those of you who follow garden history in Australia will know that she's still very influential, especially in the houses in Western Victoria. So things happen though, as I said. It's crunch time. Things go wrong. Design lets us down very badly. So we had, not so long ago, a 10-year drought. And we were all instructed that not to water our lawns and to cut back on our use of water, have a 3-minute shower. And that went on for, 2 years and more. And we have to take that into account. We are not living in England, and we can't copy English fashions. Oh, what's happened here? I got it the wrong way, sorry. Are you going to kick me off? Okay. Right. Well, after the war, we got a huge influx of migrants who changed our ideas about what gardening was about. Here's Giorgio, and his entire garden was given over to tomatoes because it was useful. He didn't mind a water bill, but what he wanted to do was follow his tradition and have food in store for later in the year. So it was making passata mostly and growing fruit trees. So those people caused the rest of us to look more closely at what we were doing. They introduced and revisited old traditions and skills like dry stone walling and planting olives up the sides of hills in a very southern European way. That's really become a landscape feature of some gardens, particularly around Perth in Western Australia. But shortly after that, we had this other idea about growing our own. And people do and did and tried a lot of different and interesting vegetables that changed the way we eat quite a bit. It was the time when garlic was introduced. Now, people would have shuddered after the war if somebody said there's garlic in the food, but we've all grown used to it and none of us have died. So we've learnt a few things. But we haven't learnt not to copy things. And this magazine has indulged a lot of people's errors, unfortunately, because it stopped people thinking about where they live. Lots of people just point at the pretty pictures and say to a garden designer or a landscaper, I want that. And no one says to them, that's not very sensible for where you are. What they say is, yes, and would you like it in time for Christmas? But some people have gone their own way in a naive gardens. Most people think they're a huge joke and take lots of photographs of them, but at least they're an expression that's not copied from anywhere else. People make it up as they go along. But others, well, like Paul Bangay, stuck with the tried and true of the European tradition. I don't know if you saw it, but his house is for sale now. If you've got $9 million, you can have it. But he made gardening possible for some people, but not all that many. Further out, people made native gardens of native plants, while in Melbourne, landscapers tried to recreate Central Australia. I don't know why you would do that in Melbourne, but they did. And we have had some interesting experiences with plants like puppy. So the way forward is to dig around for ideas. Is this going to work? Yes, right. Look at things from this way and that way. And you can see that climate change and all that stuff offers plenty of opportunities to take Australia gardens in new directions. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you.
It's lovely. Thank you.
I'll just leave that here, don't I? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Trevor. I think everybody has enjoyed your talk. And if you'd like to take a seat, and we would like to present a gift to Trevor. Yeah. Thank you, Trevor. With all of our speakers this morning, if you have any questions, if you'd like to see our fabulous guest speakers at morning tea and lunch, that would be fabulous. Thank you. Now, next we've got Sue Zwar. If Sue would like to come up, please. Sue is talking about David Ruston and his role in putting Australia on the Rose World map. Thank you, Sue. Good morning.
Excuse me, can you just show me?
Yeah, sure. That's to go forward.
Right.
That's to go back, and that's the start of it.
Right.
Point out.
Okay. Thank you. Before I begin, I have a few admissions to make. Firstly, I'm terrified. And so if you hear any quavers, that will be the reason. I'd always vowed that I'd never speak at an international conference, but I've never been able to say no to David, even when he's no longer with us. Secondly, some of the photos are of poor quality, either because they were David's or mine and taken before digital cameras, or because they've been scanned from old magazines. And thirdly, in my old age, I've become quite emotional when I talk about things close to my heart. And so if you hear double quavers, please excuse me. Now, my topic, David Ruston and his role in putting Australia on the World Rose Map. David Ruston was unique, the most unique person I've ever known, a man of superlatives, the most frustrating, infuriating, exasperating, aggravating and irrepressible of men, as well as commanding enormous admiration and respect for his vast knowledge, intelligence, flamboyant energy and huge generosity of spirit. He was completely illiterate so far as anything mechanical was concerned, but his knowledge of anything artistic and floral was enormous. It was this vast knowledge and willingness to share at no cost to others, but often a great drain on himself, that made him a star. David was born in Renmark on the 7th of March 1930, soon after his identical twin brother John. He lived in the home his parents built in 1923 for his entire life, only leaving for 2 years to go to Adelaide Boys High School and then Adelaide University. However, he so missed country life that he left university and returned home to continue working on the family property, managing the fruit block by day and planting roses by night, next to the channels that carried water throughout the property. And what the previous speaker had to say about water certainly is appropriate with David. Behind all those roses is one of the channels, and this is the same cement channel 50 years later in winter. And some of those roses are still there if you look closely. And here's David pruning one of them. When his father died in 1970, David purchased the home block from his family, and this gradually increased to 27 acres, with about 50,000 rose bushes and 5,000 varieties. His garden was known as the largest private rose garden in the Southern Hemisphere, and his knowledge of roses and their individual history was unsurpassed. Photos of David's garden can be seen in most books dedicated to roses. The swags, trellises and poles covered with roses, giving height and interest to the flat landscape. He used bulbs and perennials mixed with roses, especially at the end of each row, giving the rows of roses a very informal look. He could also call on those blooms to help with his floral displays. One of David's favourite garden areas was a picturesque spot on the far side of the main channel, where a central pond overlooked by a koi Venus was surrounded by masses of beautiful exotic trees, many of them quite rare, with David's favourites being the magnolias. Nearby, a huge archway of bloom-filled courage dominated the landscape when in flower. Most of this area died when the restrictions on water in 2004 prevented the pond being filled and the trees being flooded. Instead of concrete channels carrying water for flood use, everything had to be converted to drip irrigation. But bloom-filled courage still survives. My favourite spot was an area at the far end of David's property with the overhead sign, "Ye Old Rose Garden." This was filled with masses of gallicas suckering everywhere, interspersed with albas giving height and all sorts of other heritage roses. In the middle was a huge open-sided shed covered with an enormous Rosa Fortuniana and overshadowed by a large old cottonwood. Apricots and peaches used to be cut and dried here in the old days, but all this has disappeared with the lack of water, except for the hardier varieties that refuse to give in, such as Rosa Fortuniana and the old cottonwood. But the gallicas that were given to me by David are thriving at my place, also suckering everywhere. Another lovely garden area more recently planted in 1994 was the Austin Walk, with Graham Thomas covering a wooden arch near the entrance. David really liked the Austin roses, especially for bridal bouquets. Then in 2003, David sold his business to his niece, Anne Ruston, retaining just an acre around his house. This acre of garden was cherished and developed beautifully, with guests and overseas visitors always welcomed. David's love of flowers and arranging was very evident when wandering around his paradise. There were always arrangements of flowers inside and outside his home, some very quirky, brightening up the different areas. On David's initiative, Anne Ruston filled in one of the boundary channels so that a tea rose collection could be planted. I'm just wondering, oh no, sorry, I'm fine. This picture down here is different from up there. I'll start that paragraph again. On David's initiative, Anne Ruston filled in one of the boundary channels so that a tea rose collection could be planted. This began in 2007, began being the operative word. It expanded to include noisettes, chinas, Paniciana roses, early hybrid teas, Australian bred roses, ramblers, and if David would have had his way, Bourbons, Portlands, hybrid perpetuals, and the list goes on. Margaret Furness was forever trying to rein in David's enthusiasm. The first year's plantings took place with Pat Toolan and Margaret Furness, who organised the plants, along with John and me, who were the lackeys. Subsequent years brought in more helpers. Great camaraderie, with David excelling in his hospitality. The roses thrived in Redmark's red soil and David's tender, loving care. And the roses in these last two photos were 2 years old when the photos were taken. They're all tea roses, which is what the whole section was supposed to only consist of. In 2008, the World President, Gerald Malin, presented David and Anne Ruston with a plaque reading, "On the occasion of my visit to Renmark, I have much pleasure in presenting, on behalf of the 41 countries of the World Federation of Rose Societies and in my own name, our sincere congratulations to David Ruston. The collection in the Rose Repository contains as many teas, noisettes and chinas as possible. It is a dream come true for David and all rose enthusiasts. It is an honour for the World Federation of Rose Societies to have David Ruston as one of its members." David's first tour to England was in 1968, when the World Federation of Rose Societies was initiated in London, and his last was to South Africa in 2012. He only missed 2 World Federation conferences during that time, Chicago in 1974 because of a flood threat with the River Murray at home, and Glasgow in 2003 for health issues. He was a guest speaker and demonstrator at most of these conferences, whose members were charmed and delighted by David's flower arranging skill, where his flamboyant and often irreverent style had everyone riveted, especially as his constant commentary didn't stop him from poking flowers into his arrangements at top speed. The 1968 London conference was the first time roses from Australia had ever been shown in England, which caused quite a stir. David put together a pedestal arrangement with blooms picked in Renmark 110 hours beforehand and 12,000 miles away, and received third prize. He was also a guest speaker with the topic Informal Gardening with Roses, and flower demonstrator with Julia Clements and Baroness Lily de Gerlach de Gomery. He used a copper urn and filled it with blooms of fragrant cloud. Again in London and Oxford in 1976, David participated in a monumental event called Rose Scent to celebrate the centenary of the Royal National Rose Society. He, with 2 friends, staged a massed work called A Sunburnt Country, with Julia's rose complete with roots, branches and thorns placed upside down for down under. Then in Oxford he demonstrated to a full theatre, with people also sitting on the steps and standing at the back. Such was his popularity. 1988 was Australia's bicentenary, and Australia hosted the World Rose Convention in Sydney. And this convention today in Adelaide, the City of Roses, is the second time we're hosting the World Federation Convention. David agreed to convene the rose display, an enormous undertaking, especially as Renmark was 1,100 kilometres from Sydney. David filled the long university refectory wall with a display of roses covering the past 200 years, all from his own garden, which required an enormous amount of organising, 6,000 stems and 500 kilograms of flowers. I'd like to quote David's commentary about this occasion to let you see what a stressful time this all was. Yet David took it in his stride. We started picking on Thursday, the 7th of April, and 6 of us picked all day, labelling each variety with the name and date of introduction. I kept on finding more varieties until by nightfall we had 150 varieties ready for refrigeration overnight and packing the next day, as well as a lot of apricot and orange roses, foliage, hips and berries for the decoration of the Great Hall for the opening ceremony. We packed all Friday night, and then a lad drove me 240 kilometres to Adelaide Airport with 25 boxes of roses. We had booked these in with Ansett Airlines weeks in advance, only to be told on arrival that the plane was full and could only take 10 of the 25 boxes. The rest would go on a later flight via Melbourne. The plane was late because of heavy rain in Sydney, and when I eventually arrived, I found the taxi truck had got tired of waiting and left. After a great deal of effort, I managed to get the 10 boxes to Sydney University, where Rose Society of South Australia members had unpacked my flower vases that I'd sent on earlier and filled 60 buckets with water, ready for the mammoth task of getting 6,000 stems cut, sorted in order of year of introduction, put in water, and then carted downstairs to 2 cool rooms for storage from Friday night until Sunday morning. I went back to the airport to pick up the other 15 boxes, where the Ansett staff finally told me they'd been offloaded in Melbourne and would not arrive until the next day. The roses finally arrived at 1 p.m. the next afternoon, 20 hours after they'd been booked in at Adelaide for a 1.5-hour flight. When Richard Walsh wrote a commentary about the World Convention, he said, I'll just go back here if I can. Right. On the other side of the hall was a display of roses of a magnitude we are not likely to see again. There were more than 100 vases, each containing individual varieties introduced from the early 1800s to the present day. The magnificent array of blooms was grown and supplied by David Ruston. David and his willing helpers completed this huge task in about 4 hours. Then in Adelaide, 2008, South Australia hosted a regional conference to celebrate the centenary of the South Australian Rose Society. Again, David produced a display featuring roses bred in the last 100 years. In 2009, each branch of the South Australian Rose Society was asked to put on a special display as part of the spring show. As part of the South East branch, I brought our station wagon crammed full with buckets of rose blooms from Brian Wagner, our very generous nurseryman living near our place. When I arrived at the venue in Adelaide, David was already hard at work, filling his many and varied containers. And he continued working until we were ordered out because they wanted to shut up for the night. David still kept working and still kept getting told off. And these are the roses that he made. Single-handedly, he provided the display for both the Chaffey branch and the Southeast branch, and what a display. A special conference for David was Christchurch in 1994, which he chaired as the World President. As well as demonstrating, David also filled the venue with floral arrangements. Another special time was Benelux in 1997, when he demonstrated in the old coach house at Hex Castle, home of Comte de Sel. This magnificent garden was awarded the bronze plaque for a garden of historic significance. In 1999, John and I were privileged with 15 others to be part of the most amazing tour David led of Italy and France. And during that time, the bus shot across to Liège and we spent an enchanting day at Hex Castle with a personalised tour given by Comte de Sel. David took great pride in presenting him with the plaque that he had won. It was during this tour that I realised just how important David was to the rose world. His name opened doors, not only that of Comte de Sel. In Italy, we visited Marisa del Buffalo's magical garden, where David and she chatted like old friends, although neither understood the other's language, and they had met that morning for the very first time. Then in Carilligia, we visited Professor Fineschi's huge rose garden, where again we were honoured with a personalised tour, as well as lunch in the garden with the family, complete with Professor Fineschi's homemade wine, all because of the respect given to David. In France, we were privileged to visit André Yves' beautiful and intimate walled garden, crammed full with roses of all shapes and sizes, as well as going to his magnificent nursery. As with the World Federation, David's input into heritage roses was as great, if not greater, as his biggest passion was the older rose varieties. The first heritage rose group was formed in 1975 in California, and David was instrumental in establishing a similar group in Australia and New Zealand. Their first international conference took place in New Zealand at Hawera in 1984, followed by Adelaide in 1986, Los Angeles in 1988. His final conference was to Sakura, Japan in 2011. Shown here is Sakura's magnificent heritage rose garden, where some of the conference took place. And we loved that conference and we loved Japan. And we will definitely be going to the conference in 2025. We won't miss Japan, it's just such wonderful hosts. Again, David only missed 2 conferences, one to Charleston in 2001 because of September 11, and Sangerhausen in 2003 because of health issues. David was the prime mover behind Heritage Roses becoming associate members of the World Federation, and he was the inaugural chairman of the World Federation of Rose Society's Heritage Rose Committee. Again, David spoke and demonstrated at all these conferences, using the paintings of the old Flemish, Dutch and French painters as his base, explaining why he used each particular flower as he wowed his audience with his flamboyant arrangements. Over the years, David has received many awards, too numerous to mention. However, there are some that were especially important to him. The Dean Hole Medal from the Royal National Rose Society in 1994, the Gold Medal from the World Federation of Rose Societies in 2004, and the most prestigious award of all, the President Emeritus Award in 2009, which was awarded to David in recognition of outstanding service to the World Federation of Rose Societies and the Rose. David is seen here with his friend Walter Duncan at Vancouver, where the presentation took place. And after that event, he was telling me that he was rendered speechless. And for those of you who know David, he wasn't very often rendered speechless. October 2010 was the unveiling of the David Ruston sculpture in Renmark, David's hometown. Raising the money for this sculpture took 2 years of hard work, and David certainly also put in the hours. We had a fundraising weekend at my home, Camberwald, where again it was brought home to me just how hard David works behind the scenes when it comes to flower arranging. He and his loyal offsider, Danny Hoffman, arrived in their bus about 9 a.m. They left Renmark at 4 a.m, Camelwold being a 5-hour drive from Renmark, after picking flowers most of the previous day. The flowers had then to be offloaded and sorted and put into buckets of water. Suitable flowers were then picked from around my garden, and a friend also brought beautiful flowers from her extensive garden. Then he and Danny got to work, arranging flowers in all sorts of rustic containers we had around the farm, and these were placed around our large garden. I couldn't resist putting in this photo of my daughter Carolyn and granddaughter Meggie with John's old 1923 Dodge. David was very fond of Meggie, who he got to know quite well when he travelled to our place often during the writing of his book, A Life with Roses. This took most of Friday, and then on Saturday, David held 2 demonstrations in the garden with Danny, his offsider. He was exhausted. Remember, at this time, he was 80 years old. He also held another demonstration as a fundraiser for the sculpture at the barn, an impressive conference centre and garden near Mount Gambier, where he and Danny also beautified the venue with hundreds of arrangements. Some of you will be staying at the barn as part of the post-conference tour. The opening of the David Ruston sculpture was done by Sheena Harris, the world president at the time, who emphasised that although David was Australian, he belonged to the whole rose world, not just Australia. David celebrated his 85th birthday in style at home, and in true David style, he made flower arrangements around the garden. He's working here in front of the garage, which is where the Chaffey branch put on the luncheon that we had for him. He had a great day wearing, as you can see, his President Emeritus Award. It was only a few weeks later that he fell in the garden and wasn't found for several hours. It was time for David to go into care at Philby House, an adjunct of the Renmark Hospital where David was born 85 years earlier. Contrary to what I thought, that David would pine away and die being separated from his beloved garden, he thrived. He enjoyed the care and companionship of the nursing staff as well as frequent visitors. And it wasn't long before he'd taken over the garden around his unit. David died on the 19th of May 2019, and his funeral was held in front of the sculpture celebrating his life with roses. The flowers were magnificent, a fitting farewell to David, and put together by his friend Danny Hoffman and members of the Chaffey branch of the Rose Society. And Shan is here today, I know. Shan is one of the people who did the beautiful arrangements. As I said at the beginning of my talk, David Ruston was a unique person. An icon, a name synonymous with roses, known and respected around the rose world. Someone who will not be forgotten as long as the rose remains the queen of flowers. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue, very much. It's lovely to hear so much about David Ruston. Won't be a moment. Our next speaker is a Felco Presentation. Now, I'm not sure which presenter we've got from Felco. Coming forward now. We've had a fabulous presence of all the Felco tools within the show over the weekend. Good morning. Good morning, Henri-Anne. There we go. Of course you can, yes, yes. Good morning, Henri.
Good morning, everyone. Well, I'm very pleased to welcome Felco headquarters top management here today. You have seen them at the expo. You don't hear? It's better? Yeah, okay. I'm very pleased to welcome Felco headquarters top management today on the stage. Of course, you have seen a magnificent display of Felco products during the expo. So I would like to welcome Nabil Francis, which is the CEO, and his wife, Christelle Francis Flich, granddaughter of the founder of Felco, and Stefan Kopieski, sales director. Felco, as you know now, is a global leader in professional pruning secateurs and tools. The headquarters are based in Switzerland, nearby Neuchâtel city, which is the cradle of the Swiss watchmaking region. So no doubt that Christelle's grandfather, Felix Flich, intended to make the pruning secateurs a true precision product. Synonymous with quality and durability, the Felco brand is today the result of over 75 years of technological innovation at the service of both professional and amateur gardeners, and of course, rose lovers. It was in 1948 that the well-known Felco 2 model was launched and became the brand standard that still remains in production today. In the hands of the founder's family, the company employs in the region of Neuchâtel more than 250 people. I had the privilege to visit the factory, and I must confess that it soon became apparent that the attentiveness, genuine care, and team spirit shown are the core values of the company, which make Felco a truly caring company rather than a product supplier. Committed to respect the environment, the company has integrated sustainable development in the manufacture of the goods. We have met several times in Switzerland, and it was a real pleasure for me to see how swiftly both organizations mutually agreed that joining forces would be a perfect alliance for the benefit of rose growers around the world. An initial 2-year sponsorship agreement was signed between Felco and the World Federation, but I sincerely hope that our collaboration will continue for many years to come. I am wholeheartedly convinced that marketing and developing business is an important area that the World Federation really needs for focus on in establishing relationships with professional companies such as Felco. This will ensure that the Federation will flourish for many years to come. I would like to ask the member countries present here to have direct dialogue with Felco team management to set up marketing activities with Felco in their own countries. Felco is present in many, many countries where we have a National Rose Society. More than our global partner, Felco is also our platinum partner in Adelaide and will be platinum also in Belgium in 2023. I hope that Felco will be present at many more future World Federation events. So I am very pleased to give the floor to Nabil Francis, Christelle Francis Flich, and Stefan Kopieski. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Ladies and gentlemen, dear rose lovers, very good morning. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank and Rian for the kind words and also for putting all this together. It's a privilege for us, it's an honor for us to partner with the WFRS. Before we start the presentation, I suggest showing you a very small movie, it's a 3-minute movie, so you can see our company and you can better understand what is Felco. So I'll try to manage these complex things, and here it goes.
Christelle Francis Vlies. I'm the granddaughter of Felix and Juliette Vlies, the founder of the company Felco. If I had to describe my grandfather in few words, I would say that he was a revolutionary inventor. Indeed, he revolutionized the pruning shears using the forged aluminum handles. And thanks to his entrepreneurial spirit, he went through his ideas. He was thorough and meticulous with himself and others, but also confident and passionate. My grandfather was a very sporty man, an excellent mountaineer, and I keep really good memories climbing summits and walks by his side. Then to understand better what my grandparents have created, when I was 17 years old, I worked few weeks here in the company. I was assembling these parts here, and it was for me more of a personal experience. It helped me a lot understand the precision and the complexity that requires to build a pruning shear. Today I would say my grandfather's value remains strongly in the company. Our commitment to nature through the development of sustainable tools. We are a company located in Switzerland and marked by principles such as excellence, dynamism, team spirit and respect, a combination of transparency, trust and responsibility towards our employees. This is what makes Felco's DNA today.
Felco is a company that lives through its own value. It's a company that works for nature and in harmony with nature. The respect for the environment at Felco is reflected by the utilization of recycled material, including aluminum handles that are lifetime guaranteed. So sustainable development for Felco is this concept of interchangeability of the spare parts. This extends the durability of the tools, extends the lifetime of the tools, and those tools are sometimes transmitted from one generation to another.
My husband and I have just returned from 20 years of living abroad when he ran building materials businesses. Throughout these years, we have accumulated a lot of experience, and today we are proud to take over the group and perpetuate the values of my grandfather that we have in common.
For us, Felco is a company rich of its valuable know-how. And this is thanks to our employees that for the last 75 years, we have been achieving excellence in the manufacturing of cutting tools. Thank you very much. Thank you. So, I think you already know everything about Felco. What you might not know is the view that we have from our plant, at least when the weather is good. It's not always the case in Switzerland, but you see in the back we can see all the highest peaks of the Alps. So we are really blessed to be there in those mountains of the Jura, close to Neuchâtel, for those who knows Switzerland. Now, to give you a bit more insights about the history of our company, so the adventure has started in 1945 when Felix Vlies, the grandfather of my wife, purchased this tiny house there, you see, And this house was a small workshop because this is the watch valley in Switzerland. So basically all the companies around our plants are making those famous watches. And it was a smaller workshop. This guy was an inventor, and that was the invention of the modern sécateur there. And you know, step by step, the company has been growing, and we have been extending in the village. And for the last 78 years, you know, we are trying to make the difference with our tools, to provide tools with an inspiring performance, but also tools that are made responsibly. Today, Felco is, well, we are still a small family business. It's the third generation, so we are less than 300 people around the world, but there is a new layer of complexity, is that it's a small multinational, since we are selling in almost 120 countries, so 120 different cultures. And in the major countries, we have started to have our own subsidiaries. So you can see this in red. Those are the countries where we have our own subsidiaries. And in Australia, we have our best partner, that is Einiger. Now, we have 15 minutes left to discuss about sécateur. So I suggest we start discussing about performance, what makes a good pruning shears, and then we will go to the ergonomic. We'll also go through this concept of interchangeability that we have at Felco, and we'll conclude by sustainable development. I mean, what do we do? What can we do to reduce our environmental footprint? The WFRS, I mean, things have started last year. So it's the first time we are partnering with such a prestigious organization. And I have to say that from what I've seen here in Australia, it's really an interesting move. I've met some of you already on our stand, and I'm very impressed, because it's clear that you guys are passionate about roses, but it seems that you are also passionate about your tools. The questions you have asked are quite technical, and it's clear that you know what you are talking about. So for me, it's a good fit. It's a natural fit between Felco and WFRS. It seems that we are also sharing a lot of values together. Now, looking about performance, two things. The first part, of course, of a pruning shear is the cutting head. So the cutting head, the most important thing is the blade, and how do we differentiate ourselves at Felco is that we have our own recipe of steel. You know, the quality of the steel is important, but equally important, we have a secret recipe of heat treatment for the steel, because, you know, to give the mechanical property to the steel, you need to treat it at very high temperature. And there, our target is to find the sweet spot between ductility, means flexibility, and hardness. If we make our blades too hard, they'll become fragile, and you might break them when you do the work. And if they are too soft, you'll have to sharpen them every 5 minutes. So what makes the Felco blade is this kind of blend between hardness and ductility. And then comes the handle. And when I said that in 1945, Felix Fliess invented the modern sécateur, one of the genius was to bring a very special aluminum type to manufacture the handles. What we are using is a military-grade aluminum that is virtually unbreakable. And this is hot forged. It means we are not injecting the aluminum, we are not molding the aluminum, we're not melting it, we're just hot forging. It's a little bit like cold working, but when you hot forge aluminum, you make the material harder and you increase the mechanical performance. And that's why all our handles at Felco are lifetime guarantees, because basically you cannot break them. Now, moving to another topic that is, I would say, equally important to the cutting head, to the handles, is the ergonomic. And this was a recurring questions we have had on our stand. You know, actually it's counterintuitive, but there's a wrong. People are believing that if they buy a large pruning shear, they're gonna cut big things. And this is not true. I know some of you in the room are not believing me, so I can just encourage you to test it on the field. But what is important, and please, if you have one thing to retain from this presentation, is this: the most important thing is you get the right shear adapted to your hand. So if you have, if you have a big hand, if you have a small hand, that's the most important thing. And at Felco, we have 24 different pruning shears in our range, so we can accommodate, any size of hand, lefties, people having carpian tunnel problems, elbows, issues. We have rotating handles, and that's the most important thing for the ergonomic. Now, moving to the next concept that is unique to Felco is interchangeability. For us, it's important that even if you have bought a shear in 1945 in the company, we can still service this shear and we can still sell the spare parts. So all the spare parts are available, and any part of the pruning shear is interchangeable. And that's very interesting. There's a famous watchmaker close to us in Switzerland, and the motto, the slogan is, you'll never be the real owner of this watch, you'll just be the transmitter to the next generation. And what we see now with our shears is that they are running from one generation to another. Recently, a lady came to the plant and she was bringing the shears of her grandfather. And she said, could you fix it for me? And we said, of course. Unfortunately, it was really badly damaged. I don't know what happened to that shear, but it was a serious issue. And I was there at that time with the after-sales service, and the guy said, wow, it's going to be difficult. And the lady, she started crying. So, we all got, it was high on emotions. And I told him, no, listen, you do it the way you want, but you need to fix it. And he has managed to do it. She was very happy. And then we understood that it was more than a shear, but it was a souvenir from her grandfather. So this concept of interchangeability, like having tools that you don't dispose, but tools that you maintain, tools that you repair, it's very important. It's very important for us. And that's a good introduction, because this is also a way to reduce our environmental footprint. And this drives us to sustainability. We have noticed that we offer tools to people that are passionate, also professionals, of course, but all those people, they work in harmony with nature. All those people, they work in harmony with their plants, with their gardens. So the least we can do is to provide tools that are also carrying the same type of harmony. So having a tool that you don't dispose is already a good thing, but we try to walk the extra mile as well. So the plastic handles that you can see there, it's a special plastic also. It doesn't contain any phthalate. And in weight, all our secateurs contains more than 50% of recycled material. And last but not least, all the, since we are blessed in Switzerland to have high mountains, we have dams, so we have hydroelectricity, so 100% of our shears are processed with green energy. And we are also having our own solar panels, so we manufacture our own electricity. So that's conclude my presentations. But before I leave you, just want to say that if you Google Felco tattoo, you'll be surprised. A lot of our, sometimes we say we have more than customers, we have fans, and a lot of people are getting tattoos on their body. We have, here is just the arms. I don't know if they are in some other part of the body. I didn't go that far in my research. So we've tried to explain why, and I think the tool has become the icon of the profession, and people are so proud of what they are doing. They are proud of their garden, so they want a tattoo. So if there is one member of the WFRS that is keen to get a tattoo, we are happy to offer him or to offer her a lifetime gift. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Now there's something to think about. Yeah, a whole new thing for the conference. Now we're a little ahead of schedule this morning. Now what we would like to do is to inform you that the morning tea area is in foyer E, just behind us. So if you go out of this door here and go behind. Now our morning tea isn't scheduled until 10:25. We may be a little early, so it may not be ready, but strict instructions, everyone must be back at 10:55 because we will continue. We've got Mr. Jim Kane and Tate Hancock's up next with Alistair Clark, talking of Australian rose hybridising. So if everybody would like to break for morning... Yes, excuse me? No? Kelvin would like to have a little chat. But if I can just remind you that it's not morning tea this way today, it's out of this door and it's straight down the back. Thank you. Thanks, Kelvin.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you to our first presenters. Fantastic. You've really set the scene well. And what great memories of David and history of gardens in Australia, which of course is short compared to that internationally. Just a couple of announcements re the buses. Those who are judging the trials this afternoon, you'll all be going to the Botanic Gardens, but there are a number of you who have been informed that you will be part of an international jury to judge the trials. Those who are judging the trials must get on bus 1, which will be the first bus to leave for the Botanic Gardens. Now we have a short period for lunch today, so that means you need to be organised to get on bus 1, those who are judging the trials, bus 1. You will stay with that bus for the entire afternoon and evening. You will be the first to arrive at the Botanic Gardens and you will be the last to leave, because after you judge the trials, you will have an opportunity to look at the International Rose Garden. And then you will go straight from the Botanic Gardens by bus 1 up to Carrick Hill, where you can look at the gardens up there, and then you will stay on for the awards evening. Now, those who are going to the awards evening know that, and so that's that. The rest of you will be on the remaining buses, and I suggest you look at your bus captain and try and get back on that same bus, because if you miss your bus, then you've got to find your own way back to the city. So Carrick Hill's not far from the city, but please recognise your bus captain and stay with that bus. And tomorrow, for the garden tours, buses will be labelled A and B. Buses, those who are going to the Trimper Garden, our garden, will be on bus A, and you know who you are. That's 100 people. About 90 people are going on bus B, which is going to the other 3 gardens, okay? So make sure you know, it'll be on your lanyard, which tour you're on, and make sure you're on those buses at the same time. Some of you have asked, where will the buses be? If you walk out the entrance to the convention centre and go down to the street, which runs in front of the convention centre, it's called North Terrace, that's where you will get on and off your bus. The bus will always bring you back here, all right? So you have no problems about that. Now, the weather this afternoon may be a little showery. I think we've got some ponchos. I think we've organised those. Someone will tell me yes or no. but just be recognised that it'll be a bit showery, but there will be long, fine breaks. Don't know about the weather tomorrow yet. It might be a bit showery as well, but I think most of the gardens you are going to have some cover. But if you have an umbrella, bring it. Bring a rain jacket if you've got one, just to make sure. So that's in relation to the tours. But please, this afternoon, those who are judging the trials need to be, I think it's 1:15. You have to be, is it 1:15, Melanie, in the program? To catch the bus? Someone will tell me. 1:15? So 1:15, make sure those on bus 1 who are judging the trials are there for bus 1. Otherwise, you may miss out. Thank you very much.